Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we will be remembering the miracle, that is the liberation of Jerusalem, and the courage and bravery shown by pilots belonging to the Israeli Air Force during the Six-Day War back in June of 1967. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is a great friend of the Middle East Report, a regular on this programme. He needs no introduction. Steven Jaffe, welcome back to the Middle East Report, and it's an absolute pleasure to be doing a programme with you to mark the 56th anniversary of the Six-Day War back in June of 1967.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for having me on the programme. As always, it's a tremendous honour and a pleasure, and just to say thank you for everything that you do on Revelation TV and the Middle East Report, really, you know, bringing Israel to the forefront of people's minds at this challenging time. We'll be talking about the history today, but today Israel also faces threats and challenges, so thank you very much for all that you're doing.
That's a pleasure, and it's good to see you, Steven, because I know that you've been through kind of personal family tragedy. It's been very difficult, but you've come out of that. You've been to Israel, and give us an update on your trip to Israel that you did through the work of the Magen David Adom UK.
Yes, Simon, so I'm just back, and as always, coming back from Israel is a bit of a wrench. I do find that, but we were taking a group of mainly Jewish people, but we had a Christian lady as well, a delegation, a mission to Israel to see what Magen David Adom was doing, and we went right across the country. They have a boat on the Sea of Galilee, the Magen David Adom, if there's an emergency on the shores there. They've got a helicopter, they've got presence in the Knesset that we saw. We went to a Magen David Adom station in an Arab town called Sachnin, and there we saw working together Jewish people, Christians, Muslims, all working to do what Magen David Adom does, which is to save lives. It's part of the International Red Cross movement. So it was an eye-opening trip. As always, the organisation faces enormous challenges, and we are, you know, tremendously appreciative of the Christian friends of Magen David Adom who have stood with the organisation for many years. And we saw in Jerusalem a specially adapted vehicle which can cope with the very narrow streets of the old city of Jerusalem, which we're going to be talking about today, of course. And it's Christian friends who contributed to ensure that Magen David Adom is able to cope with a medical emergency in the old city of Jerusalem. So it was a fantastic trip, and it's fired me up.
Wonderful. I'm glad you fired up. I think we all need a bit of that. And Steven, you know, this is a special programme that we're recording today to mark the miracle of the liberation of Jerusalem that occurred in June 1967, that Israel's back was against the wall, all odds against her, and yet within 6 incredible days, Israel triples her size in territory, again getting control of East Jerusalem, particularly the Old City, including the Temple Mount and the Western Wall, as well as the biblical heartland of Israel, Judea and Samaria, the entire Sinai Peninsula next to Egypt, and of course then also the Golan Heights. Why is it so important that we mark this very important anniversary, which will be the 56th anniversary of the Six-Day War back in June 1967?
Well, we often use the phrase of biblical proportions when we're talking about something. And when you think about that war, it is so, it resonates so strongly from a biblical perspective. Israel faced annihilation, and sometimes we forget that. The various Arab states surrounding it had combined their armed forces. The rhetoric coming out of Cairo and Damascus was one of genocide. They were going to defeat Israel. They were going to drive the Jewish people into the sea. There was the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization at that time, a man called Shukri. He said that the Jews were going to have to leave the land of after they destroyed Israel, but he said he didn't think any would survive. That's what he was saying. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia was in London in 1967 visiting the Queen. He was interviewed by British media, and he talked about the elimination of Israel. This was the rhetoric that was coming out, and yet within 6 days Israel turns around this horrendous threat, which was of genocide, and this is only 20 years after the Holocaust, turns it around and as you've stated, throws back this challenge, this threat to its very existence, and Jerusalem is unified. That is a city that I visited only last week. A unified city, a city where Jews, Christians and Muslims are free to pray. Let's not forget, prior to the 6-Day War, East Jerusalem was shut to Israelis. Israelis could not visit the Western Wall. That was the extent of the division of the city prior to the 6-Day War. So we're commemorating something of huge significance, which I know many of the viewers of this program will actually remember and see in terms of their own lives, their own faith, something which was dramatic, something which was life-changing for them as well.
Absolutely, and it's also, the 6-Day War was also so significant as well for students of Bible prophecy, both from the Jewish community and from the Christian community as well, to see these ancient scriptures given to the likes of Isaiah and Jeremiah and the minor prophets of Joel and others coming alive in their time. I wasn't born anywhere near 1967, but I think if I was alive and I could watch the newsreels unfold, probably in black and white at the time, and just to see that dramatic week in action and to see and hear the Israeli paratroopers when they reached the Western Wall saying, Jerusalem is in our hands again, would have been a very, very special moment to say that here we see the liberation of Jerusalem, that Jerusalem is again a united city under Israeli sovereignty, and that Israel again has the biblical heartland of Israel, which is Judea and Samaria.
Yeah, so absolutely to all of that, and I think it has inspired a generation, and I think the challenge is how do we pass that kind of inspiration down to a generation like your own and younger that wasn't alive then. How can we make them share in that excitement? You know, I was in Jerusalem, as I said, only a week ago, and I heard the sound of children playing, and I heard the rejoicing over the bride and the groom, exactly as Isaiah said. And this is a city which for thousands of years has been center of Jewish prayer, that one day we would return to the city, that the city of Jerusalem would be rebuilt. And that generation of 1967 saw it happen before their eyes. So it's a very significant commemoration. We have in this period of the Jewish calendar so many anniversaries. We've gone through from the period between Passover and the festival of Shavuot, of Pentecost. During those weeks we have a commemoration for the Holocaust, a commemoration for Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, and now we're commemorating in particular the unification of Jerusalem, but the Israel's survival from a period when it seemed that it was going to be threatened with total defeat. So it's a crowded time of the calendar, but it's important that we remember Yom Yerushalayim, which is Jerusalem Day. Absolutely.
So let's have a look at this remarkable news item or news report from CBN that highlights the history of the Israeli Defense Force that played a critical role in winning the 6-Day War in June 1967.
When David Ben-Gurion announced the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, 6 surrounding Arab nations attacked the newborn country within hours.
Then it was small units of very patriotic people, some of them Holocaust survivors who just came off the boat from Europe and put on IDF uniforms and joined battle and defended Israel in 1948 against 6 Arab armies.
CBN News interviewed Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus about the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, from its beginning in 1948 to today. He has a key perspective, serving in the IDF for more than 24 years, with the last 4 as its chief international spokesman. From that initial war that threatened its early existence, the tiny young nation faced war in 1967 and 1973 when Israel's enemies sought to annihilate the country. Outnumbered and outgunned, Conricus says Israel still had the upper hand.
I would say that our biggest advantage and what has allowed Israel to be victorious on the battlefield and off the battlefield, to defeat advancing Arab armies at a ratio of 1 to 10, what has been really at the heart of those achievements have been the excellent men and women serving in the IDF. It was never about the stuff, never about the planes, the tanks, the weapons. It was about the human spirit, their commitment to the mission, and their absolute understanding that when they look back, they see home.
Conricus credits that to Israeli soldiers, realizing they're both the front and last line of defense.
They know that their parents, their families, their communities rely on them, and therefore they did amazing achievements on the battlefield, knowing that if they fail, the country is in danger.
Conricus says Israel likely faces the biggest diversity of military threats.
On the lower end, Israel today has to deal with low-intensity threats like stone throwers, knife stabbers, and car ramming attacks. And on the higher end of the spectrum, we have to be able to deal with intercontinental ballistic missiles, perhaps in the very imminent future, with nuclear warheads flying in from Iran. We have to be able to deal with everything in between. All of that together, combined, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes on different fronts at the same time.
And as the chief spokesman for the IDF for years, Conricus knows that Israel remains on the front lines of the media battle as well.
What I found the most challenging was how so many times I felt, and I can back this up with numbers and details, I felt that Israel is held to almost impossible standards. No other military in the world is under such scrutiny and under such relentless international interest and reporting. And so many times what gets wrong in international coverage is the chronology of events, what happened first and what happened second, and cause and effect. So many times we see that getting mixed up in international reporting, whereby the media or the headline will be that Israel attacked in Gaza, killing 5 Palestinians, but no mention of the rockets that were fired at Israel before at Israeli civilians that were intercepted by the Iron Dome or that caused casualties in Israel. But it will be about Israeli actions, and so many times robbing viewers and media consumers of the real context of the story and the complexity of the situation and the threats that Israel faces.
As Israel still faces threats to its existence, Conricus hopes today's IDF can capture the spirit of those early pioneers.
To go back to our roots of 1948 and even before that, look at the spirit, the daring spirit of the IDF, and remind ourselves that that kind of spirit, that kind of ability to take calculated risks, to strike preemptively, not to wait for the enemy to take the initiative, but to take the battle to the enemy and to do daring, brave and creative things is, I think, what is needed on all fronts against all of our enemies. The message should be that Israel is strong, focused, has the capabilities and most importantly the will to safeguard itself and defend itself.
And we have to say, really, that the courage shown by Israeli men and women ever since the foundation of the modern state of Israel back on the 14th of May in 1948, who actually serve and fight for Israel, the only Jewish state in the world. They deserve our praise, but also very much deserve our prayers. So keep them in our prayers. It's so important because they are the ones that protect the nation of Israel. Stephen, today, sadly, we're seeing a lot of revisionist history being written about, particularly when it comes to the Six-Day War, really saying that Israel was a powerful state prior to the Six-Day War in June 1967, that Israel had a powerful army, that they wanted to actually dominate the region, and that they actually carried out an invasion of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in order to maximize and gain as much territory as they wanted. But we know the reality of that situation is the exact opposite, as you said earlier. Just share with us the precarious strategic situation that Israel was actually in May of 1967.
Absolutely. So the crisis is bubbling up in May 1967. Nasser has moved his troops into the Sinai. He's forced the United Nations out from there. He's blockading the southern port, the passage of ships through the Red Sea. And what is Israel at that time? It's a country of 3 million people. You know, that is an amazing fact. It's tiny. It's 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. The combination of Arab armies, the idea that they could split Israel in two from the Jordanian positions to the Mediterranean Sea was an absolute strategic risk that Israel faced. The Arabs were armed by the Soviet Union with the latest of their planes and tanks. The ratio is something, I think, like they had three planes to every Israeli plane. I think the tank ratio was even more in the Arab army's favor. So yeah, these people with hindsight can come up and say, yes, but of course Israel won, they were a better organized society. Well, maybe they were, but that in itself was a huge commitment of a nation state, which population at the time was about that of Greater Manchester, facing the combined forces of Egypt, of Jordan, of Syria, with the support of Iraq, countries further away like
Kuwait as well.
Kuwait was arming and ready to take part, so was Libya. I mean, they wanted to dispatch their troops. Thankfully, the war was over so quickly that they didn't have the opportunity to arrive. But yes, it's very easy for these commentators to turn truth on its head, that this was a war of aggression on Israel's part. In fact, Israel took every step to prevent war. I know the career of Abba Eban is something which particularly interests you, Simon.
Absolutely.
So Abba Eban was dispatched to Paris, to London, to Washington in order to avoid war. He spoke with de Gaulle, with Harold Wilson, who was the British Prime Minister at the time, with President Johnson. And the Israelis sought everything to avoid conflict. They did not wish to go to war. Never, I think this is Abba Eban's phrase, never was a war less wanted so far as Israel was concerned. And yet that's now turned around into a war of aggression in Israel's part. Just listen to the rhetoric coming out of the Arab capitals at the time. And as I've said, it was one of annihilation. This was their opportunity to settle scores. They'd lost in the War of Independence in 1948. Now they felt armed by the Soviet Union, combined, and Nasser felt that this was his moment to strike and defeat Israel and bring it to its knees. So it takes a lot of goal, I think, to turn the truth of 1967 on its head, but that is exactly what many academics are saying, many of the mainstream media are saying, and it is a narrative that we have to face head on.
Absolutely, and there's two very important points you made there that we have to clear up as well, that America at this time was not an arms supplier to Israel. So the United States did not have Israel's back in terms of military protection. Israel had to rely on the French President de Gaulle for its arms and its weapons. So this is why Israel flew, I think it was the French military aircraft, the Mirage. Yep. Also, the other thing linked to that as well, that it was Abdel Nasser, the French president, who said that we are going to throw the Jews into the sea. So Israel was facing a possible war of annihilation. And the other aspect, I think, of this one to bring in, and that's the incredible covert work or the work done of Eli Cohen in Syria as an Israeli Mossad spy, and the role that he played in getting intelligence into the hands of the IDF and the chief of the IDF, so that they could plan properly how that they could carry out an offensive against Syria. Because we know, if you watch the Netflix documentary on Eli Cohen's life, of how the Syrians were constantly bombing Israeli kibbutzim, they were bombing Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, fishing ships with their mortars from that strategic heights of the Golan Heights onto Israel.
So yes, a lot to unpack there, but you're quite right. So de Gaulle had been the armour, had been supplying arms to Israel, and yet when Abba Eban met him in Paris, de Gaulle completely was prepared to abandon Israel. He said, if you strike first, you're on your own. President Johnson, I think, said to Abba Eban, Israel will go it alone if it chooses to go it alone. In other words, everyone was restraining Israel to such an extent, even though they knew the impact of what an Arab attack on Israel would be. As we've said, Israel didn't have the Sinai Desert as a buffer against Egypt. It didn't have the Golan Heights as a buffer against a Syrian attack, and it didn't have the area which the world calls the West Bank, which is Judea and Samaria, as a buffer for a Jordanian Iraqi attack. It was very, very vulnerable. And yet the assistance, as you say, America was not an unquestioning ally of Israel. It was holding off and holding back. It tried to say that it would have an international initiative to reopen the Straits of Tiran, where the Israeli boats were being blockaded and not allowed through. But Israel was standing alone at this time. You're right, the spy Eli Cohen, it's an amazing drama on Netflix with Sacha Baron Cohen playing a very serious part of the intelligence that Israel relied upon. Being so small, intelligence is crucial. So, the amazing thing with Eli Cohen was he convinced the Syrians that to ensure that their soldiers would not be suffering from sunstroke, that they should plant eucalyptus trees where their tanks and artillery positions were hidden. So the Israelis knew exactly where to strike. Eli Cohen very sadly paid with his life for the work that he did, but Israel depended hugely on that kind of intelligence. They also had very highly placed spies in Nasser's Egypt as well. So there were, tremendous heroism even before the war had broken out to enable Israel to pinpoint where it needed to strike.
Absolutely. I first heard that story with my program with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. We're up in the Golan Heights, having a look at the big eucalyptus trees, and then being told that of the story of Eli Cohen and how he actually paid for, obviously through the Israeli government, the planting of eucalyptus trees. So as soon as the war started, of course, then the Israelis knew that this is where the Syrian tanks were hiding. This is where the armory of the Syrian army was based. So it was easy to take out an airstrike. So I mean, it's
stranger than fiction, but actually true. It reminds me in many ways the whole story of the 6-Day War of the Book of Esther, because there's fact after fact after fact, which becomes so incredible, so almost beyond reason, because that's the divine outwork of it all. And it's very much the same thing with the 6-Day War. You cannot explain it entirely on rational terms. How a country of 3 million people can so effectively turn around a challenge to its very existence. It's the Book of Esther written in our own day.
That's incredible. I've never seen it like that before, but now you're reflecting on it, it's very similar. Dire straits, I think, in the beginning, and then triumphant at the end. So let's have a look at this remarkable news report produced by our friends at CBN. And this one is called Operation Focus, the role of the Israeli Air Force in that crucial first few hours of the 6-Day War back in June of 1967.
In May of 1967, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, declared war on the State of Israel, telling his followers, "Our path to Palestine will be covered with blood." Nasser moved his troops into the Sinai Peninsula, expelled the UN peacekeepers there, then blocked the Straits of Tiran to Israeli ships. For Israel, it was time to strike or be struck. And for the next 3 weeks, the Israel Defense Forces were on high alert.
The atmosphere in Israel before the war was very tense. People thought we were facing total extinction. 40,000 coffins were prepared, and no one was sure that the IDF could really handle the Arab armies. 2 weeks after the birth of my son, I had to leave him without knowing if I would ever see him again.
Armed by the Soviet Union, the Egyptians had the largest and best air force in the Arab world. Israel's only chance of survival was a preemptive strike. And the Air Force had prepared for this moment for more than a decade. Their plan was called Operation Moked, which means focus in Hebrew.
Operation Moked was the brainchild of Ezra Weitzman. He was commander of the Israeli Air Force. He was a pilot himself. He was a pilot in the British Air Force in World War II, flew Spitfires, later the president of Israel. And it was an incredibly daring program.
The plan was for dozens of squadrons to strike 11 airfields throughout Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula.
The main goal was to strike when all the Arab planes were still on the ground, fully exposed. And the idea was to bomb out the runways first to prevent any aircraft from taking off and to keep them from flying for a few days.
In 1966, the plan's creator, Ezra Weitzman, had been promoted to IDF Chief of Operations, and his successor, General Moti Hod, now had the task of executing Weitzman's plan.
Moti was a commander of the Air Force that kept on flying as a fighter. He understood what we felt in the cockpit, so he understood the issues. Brave man, the nicest person in the world. He had nerves from a metal and always thinking forward, ahead, like he did on the time to attack Egypt.
For Israeli civilians, the pre-war tension was high. But for Air Force Squadron Commander Yalo Shavit, Israel's victory was inevitable.
The Israeli Air Force is like a tide spring, ready to somebody to cut the cable that prevents it from. It will be done in no time because we have been trained since the last 11 years. I told my wife, go to Gedera. Gedera is a small village in the south. Find a small toferet, a lady tailor. And you know, what do you want to wear for parties with all the who's and who's, prime minister and down? Have 3 sets. Why 3? I said, because I'm telling you to do 3. There will be parties. He says, you're crazy. I said, listen to me, go and do it. She did it. She was the best woman dressed in the parties.
Israeli intelligence had spent years gathering details about the Egyptian targets. From the location of each plane to the name, rank, and even the voice of each pilot.
I was one of the youngest pilots in the Air Force. I had graduated from pilot training the year before the war. I wasn't even 21 years old yet. I was the intelligence officer of the squadron. For 3 weeks, we learned the most accurate intelligence we could learn. We also prepared the combat doctrine for attacking airports. I was a part of that system.
It was so confident that they know exactly what to do. They trained so many times, they knew it with closed eyes. To receive an aircraft with empty fuel tanks, with empty munition, with empty whatever. And they got to a record of 8 minutes. 8 minutes to prepare the aircraft to be ready to take off.
Monday morning, the 5th of June, they woke us up and we went down to the base. We knew that the big moment had arrived. The commander of the Air Force came in with the wing commander, and they said, "Dear friends, Operation Focus will start today at 7:45 a.m. sharp. This is a fateful operation. Friends of yours will be injured and killed in battle right next to you. It is going to be tough, but we will make it." Then the wing commander told us that the fate of the Jewish people was on our shoulders. We were not afraid for ourselves. The only fear was that we would not be able to perform our duties in the best way possible.
When I took off, I didn't realize it will be such a complicated mission.
Squadron leaders gave their pilots some ground rules, issued by Commander Moti Hod.
And what was so incredible about the raid on the Egyptian Air Force is that the Israeli Air Force carried out more sorties than any other nation has ever done in one single day, which is an incredible feat of aviation history. Before we talk a little bit more about the role that the Israeli Air Force played, particularly during those crucial hours of the start of the war in June 1967, you alluded to this, but I think we also have to put the Six-Day War in its historical and political context. That Israel was part of the West against its war against the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union's clients included Egypt and Syria and Iraq at the time as well. And so this also played a major role within the Cold War aspect of it, didn't it? So it just wasn't just Israel versus, say, for example, the Egyptians or the Jordanians or the Syrians or the Iraqis, but was also Israel against the Soviet Union as well at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. The Soviet Union played a crucial part in all of this. It provoked the crisis in many respects. It promoted the story that Israel was about to invade Syria. This was untrue. The Israelis challenged observers to come to the Syrian border. There wasn't a single division there, but the Soviets were playing a very dangerous game. The Syrians then provoked Nasser because they said, you want to be the leader of the Arab world, Nasser? Well, this is your moment, because if we're going to be invaded, then you're going to have to step up. So everybody was provoking each other on the Arab side, and the Soviet Union was a key to that for its own purposes. Yeah, this was just after the Vietnam War, of course, is raging, and America is facing all sorts of challenges there, and the Soviet Union is looking to drive Western influence out of the Middle East. So there is a Cold War aspect to all of this. It turns out that the Soviet military hardware that they were arming the Arab states with didn't perform well, as we're going to discover. Possibly, perhaps, the Arab armies weren't sufficiently trained to use them. But that isn't to say that at the time people saw the Arab states armed to the hilt with Soviet weaponry much in excess of what Israel had at its disposal, and there was no guarantee that in any sense that Israel could meet the challenge, given the numbers, given the superiority in tanks and planes that the Soviets had given the Arab armies, given as I've mentioned, the equivalence of the Western support for Israel. De Gaulle had armed Israel, but now was stepping back. The Americans were not there in the same respect that we're perhaps more used to in more recent times. So Israel was facing a Cold War threat from the mightiest power on earth, certainly challenging America, and that's the Soviet Union. So it was even a greater, I would say, feat for Israel to withstand that than perhaps immediately meets the eye.
It's also important to make out that even though that Israel went on the offensive, and we'll talk a little bit now about Israel's preemptive strike and Israel's military doctrine of because Israel is such a small country surrounded by hostile Arab states that want to see a destruction, that Israel can't afford to conduct a war on her own territory. So therefore the field of operation has to be transferred to your enemy's field. So this is why the Egyptian territory, the Jordanian territory, and the Syrian territories became the theatre of war. But I think we have to also describe that, firstly, what the Egyptians were doing was illegal under international law. The blocking of the Straits of Tehran, which is Israel's main shipping line to Asia from the Red Sea. Also, the mass mobilization of troops and divisions in the Sinai that broke the UN security resolution on the Sinai Peninsula. The fact that the Egyptians took control of the Jordanian armed forces and then cooperated with the Syrians meant they're all kind of preparing for war. So what could Israel do other than carry out a preemptive strike in those circumstances? And of course, we've seen only a few years later in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the mistake that Golda Meir, as Israel's prime minister, did in absorbing attack rather than actually going on a preemptive strike as Israel did in 1967.
Totally. Well, I think the point about the Yom Kippur War is spot on, because Israel's casualty rates were huge, and the fear of being overrun was greater, notwithstanding the fact that the Arab armies were fighting further back because of the territory that had been acquired in 1967. But how close Israel came to be overrun in 1973 is entirely backs up this doctrine, as you mentioned, that Israel must take the battle onto the territory of the surrounding countries, otherwise its own population areas very quickly can be overwhelmed. So that was central to Israel's thinking in 1967. They didn't have the luxury of waiting, because if the surprise attack had come from the Arab side as it was building up, it would have been forced back. Tel Aviv is only, 20 miles from where the Jordanian forces were. That's how vital the whole situation was. And it was, I think, so important that Israel took that step. Of course, it was a brave step, an amazingly brave step, to launch the attack on the Egyptian Air Force. And let's not forget that the average age of an Israeli pilot who were involved in those attacks, 23.
Amazing.
23 years old. They had the future of Israel in their hands. So that just gives you an insight as to the remarkable events that we're talking about.
Yep, so let's have a look now at the second part of Operation Focus, and this is Israel's air offensive against the Egyptian Air Force, together with the Syrian Air Force and the Jordanian forces, actually taking those air forces out in one single day.
There is no communication whatsoever. No radio, no nothing. So we were prepared with all kind of signs and flags, colors of the flags, when you're ready to start the engine. Where you have to take off, no radio, zero. You fly at 0 altitude, the lowest you can. If something happened, you do not report back that you crashed or that you jumped. The Air Force will find you. You do whatever it takes to reach to the target. We have to destroy the aircrafts on the ground.
We were also told that the mission was more important than anything, and that even in an emergency, even if a friend of ours is about to be killed, we were not allowed to warn him. We had to just let him crash. As cruel as that may sound, this was also that we will not disrupt the operation. If someone is attacked, you have to go on and fight.
Nearly all of Israel's 196 combat planes were committed to the airstrike. Only 12 were left behind to defend the state of Israel. The planes flew low over the Mediterranean to avoid being detected by radar.
We took off and stayed between 35 feet to 50 feet. Impossible below that. We smelled the smell of the salt over the sea.
I was assigned to the foursome that was under Yallow's leadership. I was number 2 in the squadron, and our mission was to attack the En-Sash field near Cairo.
Egypt's radar didn't pick them up, but someone else did. At 8:15 Egyptian time, Jordanian radar screens lit up with an unusual concentration of planes heading over the Mediterranean. And from there, a series of mistakes gave the Israelis an overwhelming advantage. The top general in Jordan radioed the word grape, the prearranged code for war, to Egypt's defense minister in Cairo. But the Egyptians had changed the code word the day before without updating Jordan. So, the Jordanians' messages were tossed aside, and the warning never reached Cairo. But even if the message had been deciphered, there was no one around to read it. Egypt's Air Force commander was at his daughter's wedding. The ground force commander was on vacation. And the defense minister had gone to bed a few hours earlier, leaving orders that he was not to be disturbed. Egypt's chief of staff, Field Marshal Amer, was flying in that morning from an all-night party. So, at the first sign of trouble, the Egyptians shut down their entire air defense system, worried that Amer's plane might be shot down by mistake. Assuming that any Israeli attack would begin at sunrise, the Egyptians had already flown their dawn patrols and returned to base for breakfast.
Moti was the man that planned it, caused the soldiers and officers to be creative. He hit them exactly in the middle of landing, refueling, eating, ready to go. Here, boom. We reached the target, but from a distance of 3-4 minutes, I saw that there was a fog. So I started circling, finding a hole in this fog that I see the runway. I dive, I bombed the runway, everything was okay. 2 is okay. 3, I don't hear anything. 4 is okay. Something happened to this excellent officer and pilot that he tried to aim, and meantime, he lost altitude. And when he tried to recover, he hit the runway. But as we were told in the briefing before the takeoff, there is no mercy, there is only one thing: keep on doing the job.
We turned around 360 degrees and performed the second attack. The planes were already burning and there was a lot of smoke. Those bombers went up in giant flames. First I attacked a bomber that seemed to be less damaged. Then the second time I attacked an anti-aircraft battery, and then finally the control tower. The Egyptians fired some anti-aircraft missiles at my plane, but they did not hit me.
In the last second, I saw from the left anti-aircraft position, and before I knew what happened, I got a hit by 3-4 bullets. The front wheel, I saw it disappear. The aircraft stopped. My air brakes went out, and from 500 knots, it went down to 220 in no time. The 2 other, number 2 and 4, flew forward. I gave them an order: go by yourself to the base. Get as soon as possible to the sea, so nobody will shoot at you. So I found myself, after I was hit, at 3,000 foot, looking forward.
And the sheer audacity of the Israeli Air Force and the pilots to carry out these audacious raid against the Egyptians and winning air superiority was absolutely crucial to winning the Six-Day War. According to my notes here, Stephen, the Israeli Air Force outcome was determined during the first few hours of the war that I think occurred on the 5th of June 1967 as a direct result of the devastating attack on the Egyptian air bases. Later that morning, as the other Arab states entered the war, the Israeli Air Force responded by taking out Syrian, Jordanian and Iraqi airfields. And by the close of day, the Israeli Air Force commander, Mordecai Hod, announced with pride that the Arab air forces had been destroyed. It's pretty impressive in one single day.
Yeah, absolutely. Has a war been won in a day, to paraphrase a biblical quote. The couple of amazing facts about the airstrike is that the Egyptian air defences were down at the moment that Israel struck. What was happening was that the Egyptian commander was flying across the Sinai desert together with the Iraqi deputy prime minister. In order for them not to be shot down by their own air defences, they'd switched it all off that day. That was first amazing fact. The pilots record, and these were mostly secular-minded individuals, that the targets were shrouded in mist. That morning, the mist lifted at the moment of their attack. So that's something which very secular, hard-nosed young Israeli pilots felt was a miracle unfolding before their eyes. When Israel attacked the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, they had only 4 planes defending the country from possible attack from the Jordanian or Syrian Air Force. That attack didn't come. But 4 planes were left behind in order to defend the country. They were slow. And one of the reasons why the other countries were slow was that Nasser was broadcasting to the Arab world that he was, achieving tremendous victories against Israel, that Tel Aviv was about to fall. This was being broadcast from Cairo. It took days for the extent of Israel's victory to be understood and comprehended in the Arab world. So these are, remarkable facts in themselves. Put them all together and you're beyond anything that's entirely understandable.
Absolutely. So I'm going to give you, before we go to our last and final video, I'm going to actually give you some statistics. So this is according to the Jewish Library. A few statistics reveal the extent of Israel's air superiority. With only 200 fighters, the Israeli Air Force destroyed 391 enemy planes on the ground and 60 in air dogfights. The Israeli Air Force generated over 3,300 sorties, many times more than the combined Arab air forces. And a sortie means a number of missions carried out against the Egyptians or the Jordanian Air Force. It says the victory was tempered by the loss of 46 Israeli planes and 24 pilots who gave their lives in that war and changed the face of the Middle East. So let's have our final news report from CBN looking at that historic morning in June 1967 when Israel won air superiority and virtually won the war in one single day in June of 1967.
Gradually, the rest of the first wave returned to Israel. In less than 8 minutes, the planes were refueled, rearmed, and ready for a second wave of bombing. In just over half an hour, the Egyptians had lost 204 planes, half of their air force. The Israelis had lost only 19. The kill ratio of Operation Focus had exceeded expectations by almost 100%. At 10:30, General Moti Hod turned to the Army's Chief of Staff, Yitzhak Rabin, and announced, "The Egyptian Air Force has ceased to exist." The Jordanian and Syrian air forces had also been decimated. After less than 5 hours, the Israelis had complete air superiority over the Middle East.
It is truly a Hail Mary operation, but for the Egyptians, it's the ultimate humiliation. And very shortly after the Israeli aerial strike, Israeli ground forces began moving into Sinai. The goals were very limited, very limited. The Egyptians had 3 defense lines in Sinai. The goal was to take out the first of the 3 defense lines, not beyond that. But the Egyptian army collapsed so fast and began running away that the other defense lines crashed. And then, as I said earlier, Israeli forces reached the Suez Canal without even intending to reach the Suez Canal. They got sucked into Sinai. So for the Egyptians, this was the ultimate humiliation. It cannot be that the people who just yesterday you had pledged to throw into the sea are now driving you across the Suez Canal.
All day long, the Egyptian propaganda machine ran in overdrive. Radio Cairo falsely reported that Egypt had shot down 85 Israeli planes, while only losing 2 of their own. And Field Marshal Amer told the Jordanians that Israel had lost 75% of its air power, a lie that encouraged Jordan's King Hussein to enter the war.
So you have to develop a big lie. And the lie is that just the opposite has happened, that the Egyptian Air Force has surprised the Israeli Air Force on the ground and destroyed the Israeli Air Force, that the Egyptian army has crossed the border into Israel and is on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. That's the big lie. And this big lie is believed by 200 million Arabs. No one questions, the credibility, no one questions the veracity of these claims. And, there's a certain debate about the degree to which Nasser himself understood or was informed of the direness of the situation. How would you like to be the officer who walked in and said, President Nasser, I got some bad news for you? How would you like to be that person? So maybe people were feeding him strange information. There was one document I saw in Egypt was that the person who reported the Egyptian victory over the Israeli Air Force was a young Air Force captain by the name of Hosni Mubarak.
Operation Focus remains one of the most successful air campaigns in military history. During the Six-Day War, the Israeli Air Force destroyed 452 enemy planes, while losing just 46 of their own. After their stunning performance in Egypt, Yalo Shavit and his crew finished the day in Jerusalem, bombing the Jordanian tanks that raced towards the city and providing air cover for Israeli ground forces.
It was a long day. That night, I came back to the room alone because my roommate got killed that day. It was an exhausting day, both physically and mentally. Not all was taken for granted, even with the feeling of victory we had. No one was free to celebrate.
When I think about it now, after years of experience, I still think that this was a very successful mission.
If one will ask me what was the thing which made it possible so successful, I would answer it in one word: simplicity. I know that there is a lot of stories about secret weapons which we used, but we didn't actually. We used the spirit, we used the standard of flying, and we used another thing which maybe doesn't exist in any other air forces in the world, and we call it the no alternative. And when you don't have alternatives, you can achieve such achievements as we did in this war.
They don't know what a group of dedicated people, professionals, trained, willing to invest their soul and everything they have can do for a country.
And that was in tribute to the bravery and the courage shown by the pilots belonging to the Israeli Air Force and the air crew, the navigators and the ground crew staff that protect Israel's skies from today, and in the near future they may have to acquire and to go into even more deadly missions to actually defend the modern state of Israel. Stephen, sadly we've only got 5 minutes left of the programme, and I could easily go on another hour with you discussing the incredible momentous days that occurred in June of 1967. But we also have to talk about the miracle that was the liberation of Jerusalem. How would those Israeli paratroopers felt when they stormed the old city through Zion Gate? And if any of you have visited Jerusalem, seen the old city, you still see the bullet walls on the Zion Gate of the old city, to make their way down to the Western Wall and to say, Jerusalem is in our hands again.
Well, it's, as we've said, of biblical proportions. No Israeli had been allowed into the old city since 1948 in the War of Independence. It was under Jordanian occupation. The city was divided. There was frequently sniper attacks across the divide. The Jewish people's connections, of course, to this area run back thousands of years, and this would have been restoring Jewish sovereignty to an area after a gap of 2,000 years. Very shortly after the war itself was the festival of Shavuot, which is Pentecost in the Christian calendar. It's a pilgrim festival, and in 1967, in the aftermath of the war, hundreds of thousands of Israelis visited the Western Wall for the first time, for many of them in their lives. And that would have been the first time that those numbers were praying on this central part of Jerusalem since the Roman times. So that gives you a sense of the history of it, the sense of the kind of the psychological impact of it. I've had the pleasure of meeting one of the three famous paratroopers. Many people will think of the very famous image of the three paratroopers looking up as they approach the wall. So it's iconic. It still has, I think, the power to inspire us to this day. And visiting the wall that we now take for granted is something that we owe to those brave soldiers, because it was an intense battle. The Jordanians were in defensive positions. They were very well trained, and the battle to take Jerusalem was an intense battle that they faced.
Absolutely. I think it's also important to note that even the British, when they're in control of the British mandate, never allowed the Jewish people to visit and to pray at the Western Wall. So we know that religious freedom is available to all because of Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem. But 56 years on from the miracle that is the liberation of Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria during that momentous 6 days back in June of 1967, and we saw that God's master plan was in action, that God's plan of protection for Israel and the Jewish people was on the cards. What can we learn today, 56 years on, from that historic week back in June of 1967, Steve?
Well, I think the first thing I would say, and I think it's an important point to make, is it's not a glorification of war, because 800 Israelis died in that war, and the number of Arab casualties we'll probably never know, but it's something in the region of 10 to 15,000. So it's not a glorification of war itself. As we've said, Israel made every attempt to avoid war. I think a fundamental lesson to get out there to the wider world is that, we're told that the cause of conflict is Israel's occupation of what the world calls the West Bank. That's the cause, and it's settlements that are the obstacles to peace. Actually, the Six-Day War proves that the attempts of the Arabs, the surrounding Arab states, was to destroy Israel even prior to Israel occupying a single inch of that land. Therefore, the conflict, I believe, and this is something that we need people to understand out there, is that it's about Israel's existence. It has never been about purely about settlements and UN resolutions regarding that. It's about Israel's right to exist as a sovereign Jewish state in its part of its ancestral homeland.
Amen. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me for this special programme as we mark the Six-Day War. And thank you for watching this programme at home. To actually be alive during those days would have been absolutely incredible, as like many of you would have been, to see the fulfilment of biblical prophecy unfold before your very eyes, to see that Israel her back was up against the wall. Against all odds, Israel tripled her size in territory within 6 days. And we saw the miracle, which was the liberation of Jerusalem, fall back under Israeli sovereignty. So we know that history is God's story. So thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.